I'm Marissa, 33 years old, and I never thought I'd stand in my parents' home on New Year's Eve and hear my own father point at me and declare I wasn't wanted in the family. The chandelier lights sparkled above, glasses clinked, but every sound felt sharp against the silence that followed his words. I didn't break the way he expected, and that was the moment everything began to shift. But what happens when the daughter they've relied on for years refuses to stay silent any longer? Stay with me, because before midnight struck, the truth I uncovered turned their celebration into chaos and left them facing a reality never imagined. Let me take you back to where it began. The air inside my parents' house in Greensboro felt heavy that New Year's Eve, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The dining room was lit with the glow of chandeliers I remembered helping my mother pick out years ago, back when I still believed every family gathering was worth saving. Guests filled the long oak table, glasses clinking, laughter spilling into the hall as cousins and neighbors leaned in close to share jokes I was not a part of. The sound of silverware on china was steady, almost rhythmic, like a clock ticking toward midnight. I carried a tray of homemade pecan bars into the room, my hands shaking just slightly from the weight of the plate and the silence that followed me in. I could feel eyes turning, then quickly turning away, the kind of glance people give when they don't want to admit they've noticed you. I set the tray down near the end of the table where there was no empty chair waiting. My sister Caroline smirked, tilting her glass of wine in a silent toast that wasn't meant to celebrate. The room went quieter than it should have, and that was when my father stood. Thomas Miller, 62 years old. Former history teacher who always believed his word carried the weight of scripture. He cleared his throat, drawing every face toward him. He didn't look at the guests, not even at my mother seated to his right. His finger lifted sharp and steady, pointing across the table straight at me. "No one in this family wants you here tonight." His words landed heavier than any door slamming in my life. For a second I thought I had misheard him, that maybe the ringing in my ears had twisted something. But then the silence confirmed it. The scrape of a fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. The low gasp from my cousin Nathan, who never dared to speak against my father. The sudden stillness of Linda, my mother, who lowered her eyes to her plate as though she had been expecting it. I felt the heat climb my chest, a burn that might have reached my face if I hadn't forced it down. My throat wanted to close, my hands wanted to shake, but I steadied them by pressing my palms against the edge of the table. I did not let him see me break. Instead, I let the corners of my mouth lift in a small smile, quiet and deliberate. "All right," I said, my voice calm enough to unsettle even me. The words hung in the air, simple but final. I watched his jaw tighten, his hand still raised as though he expected me to argue, but I didn't. I didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't ask what I had done wrong. I let the silence do the work. It spread through the room like smoke, curling around every guest, suffocating the small talk that had filled the space minutes earlier. Caroline leaned closer to Brian, her husband, and whispered something sharp that made his mouth twitch in amusement. I caught the glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she looked back at me, but I held my smile steady as stone. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass of water. She didn't speak, didn't defend me, just took a long sip as though drinking could wash the words from the room. A neighbor at the far end cleared his throat, trying to restart the chatter, but his voice faltered. The damage had already been done. No one could pretend they hadn't heard. I shifted my weight, slowly lowering myself into the chair closest to the door. The seat was stiff, the cushion thin, but it gave me just enough grounding to keep from collapsing under the weight of the moment. My father sat down again, his eyes still locked on me. The clatter of silverware resumed in uneven bursts, forced conversation rising here and there, brittle and sharp. The room tried to recover, but it couldn't. Not with those words still hanging in the air, clinging to the chandelier crystals bouncing off the polished wood floor. I folded my hands in my lap, staring at the tablecloth, tracing the faint embroidered pattern with my eyes. My heart pounded, but my face didn't betray it. I let the silence work through me, steadying me, turning my pain into something harder, colder. Across the table, Caroline whispered again, and this time I caught the words. She finally got what she deserved. I inhaled slowly, filling my lungs with air that felt heavier than it should have. My smile remained, though inside my thoughts raced, each one sharper than the next. They thought they had erased me with a sentence. They thought those words could push me back into the shadows for good. The clock on the wall ticked toward 11:30. Outside, muffled cheers and distant firecrackers hinted at celebrations rising across the neighborhood. Inside, the house was split in two, one side clinging to forced laughter, the other side me holding the silence like a blade. My fingers brushed the edge of my purse, resting at my feet. Inside, tucked carefully between folded napkins, was the small black USB drive I had carried with me from Raleigh. It was lighter than it felt, a piece of plastic no bigger than my thumb, yet it held enough weight to shatter the image this family had built around themselves. I kept my palm there, resting quietly while the voices at the table struggled to find footing again. I looked up once more at my father. His shoulders were squared, his fork moving methodically as if nothing had happened. But I noticed the stiffness in his posture, the way he avoided my gaze, now that I had not given him the reaction he expected. He had thrown his stone into the water, but I had refused to ripple. The house hummed with a false kind of noise, conversations straining to fill the cracks, glasses raised without enthusiasm. My silence sat between us, unmovable, stronger than any retort I could have given. It was the first time in years that I realized the power of not defending myself. The air outside was alive with the promise of midnight, but inside I sat still. My hands folded, my smile fixed, my pulse steadying. The tray of pecan bars sat untouched at the end of the table, a sweet offering ignored just like me. I knew then the night was only beginning. There was a time when December meant excitement, when the first week of the month brought a flurry of emails in my inbox, titled Christmas in all caps from my cousin Jenna, or detailed notes from Caroline about who would bring which pie and what color table runner matched the dishes. That was the rhythm of our family, messy and sarcastic but dependable. I used to check my phone at work during my lunch break and see a long string of messages with everyone chiming in, teasing, bickering, and planning. Last year, that rhythm broke. I remember sitting at my kitchen table in Raleigh with a mug of coffee cooling too fast and my laptop glowing in front of me. I refreshed my inbox again and again, waiting for the familiar subject lines, but the screen stayed blank. The group drive we had used every holiday showed a red message across the top: access denied. At first I thought it was a glitch, some forgotten password, but when I tried an old link, the result was the same. It was like a door I had always walked through had suddenly been bricked over. That same morning my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Don't worry, I figured you'd be busy this year. No need to stress about Christmas." I read it twice, my chest tightening with every word. It didn't say "we miss you." It didn't ask if I had plans. It didn't leave room for me to reply. It was a dismissal dressed up as casual. I set the phone down and stared at it until the screen went dark. Later that day, I scrolled through Facebook, even though I hated doing it. The first post was a picture of my mother's dining table crowded with 12 people. There was my aunt lifting a glass, my cousins leaning in close, Caroline in the center, smiling wide with her arm wrapped around Brian's shoulder. I zoomed in and saw the chandelier glittering above them, the same one I'd helped my mother choose when the old fixture broke. Her hand rested on Caroline's back in a gesture that felt like a coronation. The caption under the photo said, "Doing what's best for the whole family is not always easy, but it's worth it." My stomach dropped as I read the comments. "Hard choice but necessary," Nathan had written with a string of clapping hands from Caroline beneath it. They weren't just leaving me out by accident, they were making a point. The memory that cut the deepest came from the Christmas before. I had left work late after a meeting with a client and got caught in traffic arriving at my parents' house after the meal had already started. My arms were full of wrapped gifts, my hands sticky from balancing a tray of cookies I had baked at 2 in the morning. When I stepped into the kitchen, no one looked up. The table was full, every chair taken, laughter filling the room like I was a stranger crashing a party. Caroline glanced at me and muttered, "Look who finally showed," and someone laughed, though I never caught who. Not one person moved a chair. Not one person made room. I ended up standing at the counter with a paper plate, eating in silence, while the sound of clinking glasses and toasts floated in from the dining room. I had told myself then it was just holiday chaos, a mistake, people stressed and distracted. But now, sitting in my apartment months later staring at that Facebook post, I knew it wasn't chaos, it was choice. The following week, I mailed out gifts I had bought carefully through the year. A scarf. The exact shade of blue my mother wore in her old school photo, a bracelet Caroline had admired back in May, small ornaments that matched the ones we had as kids. I paid extra for shipping tucked handwritten notes inside, and pictured the smiles when they opened them. A few days later, another photo appeared online. My mother wore the scarf draped proudly around her shoulders. Caroline held up the bracelet with a grin, the ornaments glistened on the tree. The caption underneath read, "From all of us." My name was not mentioned once. Relatives left comments thanking the family, not me. My effort had been swallowed whole, rewritten as if I had never existed. That was the pattern. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, each time I contributed money or gifts or time, but the recognition vanished. Cakes ordered with my card were credited to the group. Decorations I hung appeared in pictures tagged as teamwork. My presence erased my resources absorbed. I told myself for years that giving should not need recognition, that family meant sacrifice without applause. But watching them sip wine and smile in that photo, my scarf wrapped around my mother's shoulders, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't about applause. It was about being written out of my own life, as if the only part of me worth keeping was my bank account. The silence of those missing invitations, the absence of my name, in captions, the laughter when I walked into a full room, they built on each other until the weight became undeniable. It was not forgetfulness. It was not carelessness. It was design. I closed my laptop that night and sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, listening to the tick of the clock on the wall. Outside, neighbors strung Christmas lights, their kids shouting in the yard, laughter spilling into the cold air. Inside my apartment, the air pressed heavy, thick with a truth I could no longer ignore. I didn't reply to my mother's text. I didn't call Caroline to ask what was happening. I didn't beg for a place at the table. I let the silence stand, because deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The following morning, my phone buzzed again. The group chat that had once been filled with emojis and chaos was gone. Not muted, not archived, gone. In its place was a notification that the holiday thread had been renamed The Real Ones. My access denied, my name erased. I stared at the screen, the glow blurring in my eyes. It was as if they had signed a contract among themselves to cut me out, to make sure I never found my way back in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my family together. I felt like I was standing outside a locked door, listening to their voices inside and realizing they had no intention of letting me back through. That was the moment when the fracture became permanent. It was no longer a suspicion or a fear. It was fact. They had drawn a line and left me on the other side. The coffee pot hissed in the background, the smell filling the room, grounding me in the quiet. I poured a cup, set it down in front of me, and pressed my palms to the table. My reflection stared back from the dark surface of the laptop, harder now, sharper, the face of someone who had finally stopped pretending. I knew then that my father's words at the table were not a sudden outburst. They were the verdict of a family that had been rehearsing my absence for years. And I also knew that silence, the same silence they thought would erase me, could be my answer. I let it settle into me, steady and cold, waiting for the day it would speak louder than anything they had ever said. The following week, I sat at my kitchen table in Raleigh, with my laptop open and the familiar spreadsheet staring back at me. The rows of numbers stretched down the screen, neat and orderly, a quiet record of the life I had been carrying on my shoulders. Mortgage, utilities, property taxes, insurance, the same figures repeating month after month like the tick of a clock. I scrolled up to the top. The first entry dated January of 2018, $1,350, neatly withdrawn from my account for the mortgage. I traced the column with my finger, as if touching the glass could somehow make the weight of those payments feel less heavy. 5 years. 60 months of money leaving my account without a single miss, without a single thank you. Vacations? I had skipped clothes I never bought, dinners turned down so that payment would be there on the first. It looked tidy on the screen, but to me, it was the map of every compromise I had made, every piece of myself I had pushed aside to keep a roof over a house that was not mine. I clicked into the folder where I kept scanned copies of important documents and opened the loan file. The PDF took a moment to load, the black letters sharp against the white background. At the top, clear as day, was my father's name, Thomas Miller, listed as the sole owner. Below that, smaller, was my own name. Not as owner, not as co-owner, just as co-borrower. The person who had made the loan possible, but who would never be tied to the house itself. I leaned back in my chair, pressing the heel of my hand to my forehead. The paper trail I had avoided studying too closely all these years stared back with a truth I had been too naive to face. I wasn't keeping us afloat together. I was the life vest strapped onto him for convenience, the invisible guarantee, so he could sit at that dining table and call me unnecessary. My chest tightened, the kind of pressure that doesn't let you breathe evenly. I tried reading it again on my phone as if the words might shift on a smaller screen, but they didn't. Owner Thomas Miller. Co-borrower Rachel Miller. The language was cold and different, written in a way that left no space for love or loyalty. I pushed my chair back and walked to the kitchen counter, pulling open the drawer where I kept a folder of physical copies. The paper was crisp, the notary stamp pressed deep into the corner. I read the lines out loud, hearing the legal phrases echo in the silence of my apartment. Each word was another nail locking me into responsibility without recognition. Anger rose in me, hot and sharp, then drained, just as quickly, into something colder. Clarity. I thought of every birthday my mother hosted in that house, the oven running, the lights glowing, the laughter spilling into the yard, all of it powered by accounts with my name at the top. No one ever asked if the bills were heavy. No one ever offered to split the costs. It was simply assumed, Rachel will handle it. I opened another tab on the laptop, scrolling through emails where autopay confirmations sat neatly archived. Gas $280 a month, electric $340 depending on the season. Internet always due the same week as property taxes. It was a rhythm I had lived by, a quiet drumbeat that ordered my life more than any calendar. I remembered the conversation in the kitchen years ago when my mother first asked me to co-sign. Her voice had been casual, almost light-hearted. Just until the bank feels comfortable. Once things are stable, we'll switch it. She had waved her hand as if it were nothing, and I had believed her because back then I still believed promises from her. Now, staring at the stark black letters on white paper, I knew better. Stability had come, years had passed, but nothing had been switched. The arrangement had simply become another invisible expectation, another unspoken rule that I would give, and they would take. The apartment felt smaller as I paced the floor, creaking under my steps. I pressed my palms against the counter, grounding myself against the weight pressing in. My reflection in the darkened microwave door looked unfamiliar. Eyes sharper, mouth set tighter. The heater clicked on, rattling softly, and the sound only reminded me of the utilities tab in my spreadsheet. How many times had I shrugged off the sting of another bill because I told myself, family comes first? How many nights had I stayed late at work, shifting numbers around, making sure nothing ever bounced while they toasted each other under that chandelier? I closed the file and returned to the spreadsheet, scrolling slowly through the years. The tidy columns mocked me now. They were not just numbers, they were chains. Chains I had carried willingly. Chains I had hidden even from myself until the weight became too obvious to ignore. I pulled a notebook from the shelf and uncapped a pen, writing each account by hand. Mortgage, gas, electric, internet, property taxes, insurance. Next to each I wrote the draft date. January 1st, January 3rd, February 10th. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt, each digit pressed firmly into the page. I sat back and let the pen rest across the notebook. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to ache, but this time it felt different. It wasn't emptiness, it was awareness. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street, where a delivery truck idled a driver, carrying boxes wrapped in festive tape. Across the street, a family adjusted an artificial tree, laughter spilling onto their porch as colored lights flickered to life. Their joy looked effortless, as if the world itself wanted to confirm the difference between them and me. Behind me, the laptop screen dimmed, the spreadsheet, still open, the numbers still lined in perfect order. I knew I couldn't keep looking at them without doing something. I turned back to the table, slid the notebook beside the laptop, and let my hand rest on the cover. For years I had believed silence was safer, that pretending not to see would shield me from the truth. But the truth had been there all along, recorded in tidy cells and stamped in legal ink. And now that I had let myself see it clearly, there was no way to unsee it. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the steam curling upward, blurring my vision for just a moment. I set it down without taking a sip, and pulled my chair closer to the table. My eyes returned to the screen, to the notebook, to the folder of documents fanned across the wood. The weight of it all pressed into me, not to crush me this time, but to steady me. The numbers were no longer invisible. They were evidence, and evidence meant power if I was willing to use it. I closed the folder slowly, stacking it neatly, aligning the edges, as if that small act of order could make sense of the years behind me. Then I set my palms flat against the table and breathed long, and even feeling something cold but certain settled deep in my chest. The silence in my apartment was different now. It didn't ache. It hummed low and steady, waiting. It was late on a Tuesday night when my phone buzzed across the counter, the screen lighting up with Tammy's name. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. It was past 10, I was tired from a long day, and I didn't have the energy for another conversation that ended with me questioning my own sanity. But something in my chest told me to answer. Her voice was quiet, almost shaky. "Rachel, I have something you need to hear." I straightened in my chair, the weight in her tone pulling me upright. "What do you mean, Tammy?" She hesitated, then I heard a click, the faint shuffle of her breath. "I recorded them. Last week. I couldn't sit on it anymore." My pulse quickened, a hard thud in my ears. "Recorded who? What are you talking about?" She let out a shaky breath. "They were in the living room talking about you. Uncle Tom, Aunt Linda, Caroline, even Brian." I couldn't listen and just let it disappear like always. I hit record. "I'll send it now. Keep it safe." Before I could ask another question, the call ended. A moment later, a notification appeared. An audio file waiting in my inbox. My hands trembled as I clicked it open, the play button glowing like a dare. The sound filled my apartment. The clink of glasses, muffled laughter, the background chatter of people too comfortable in their cruelty. Then Caroline's voice, sharp and familiar. She is so cold. Everything she does feels calculated, like she wants applause just for being decent. Laughter followed, low and mean. My throat tightened. Then came my mother's voice, steady, flat, like she was discussing the weather. "She isn't really family, she's just convenient." The word landed like a slap, louder than the others. Convenient. Not daughter. Not sister. Not blood. Just a tool. More laughter this time, stronger, more certain. Then Brian's voice cut through smooth, like he was explaining something at the bank. "Don't stir the pot. Keep her name on the papers. It's clean. No need to rock the boat." The recording clicked off, leaving silence heavier than any sound I had ever heard. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, my phone heavy in my hand, the darkness of my apartment pressing closer. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything I had been clinging to and left nothing in its place. For years I had told myself, maybe I was being too sensitive, maybe I was imagining the shift, maybe I was wrong to feel excluded. But now I had their voices, their laughter, their certainty. I pressed play again, unable to stop myself, as if hearing it one more time would make it real in a way my brain could process. Caroline's sharp tone, Linda's cold dismissal, Brian's calculated suggestion. Each line cut deeper, each laugh echoing off the walls of my small apartment. Tears welled hot in my eyes, sliding down my cheeks before I could stop them. They weren't loud sobs, just a steady stream, quiet and unrelenting. I pressed a tissue to my face, but my hands shook as I wiped at the salt on my skin. I whispered the word out loud, testing how it felt outside my head. Convenient. My voice cracked. I stood pacing the length of the apartment, the hardwood creaking under my steps. I pressed my palms into my eyes until sparks danced in the darkness. The word looped in my head, a cruel mantra I couldn't shake. At one point I gripped the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles whitened. I thought of every late night I stayed up working just to make sure the mortgage draft cleared. Every birthday cake ordered with my card. Every light left on in that house powered by an account under my name. They never saw me as family. They saw me as the convenient one, the safety net, the wallet. I dropped back into the chair, the recording still glowing on my screen. My finger hovered, then I dragged the file into the same folder where I had saved the spreadsheets and documents. Frozen accounts. The icon appeared alongside the rest, another piece of proof, another nail in the coffin of the story they had tried to write about me. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. My breathing was uneven but steadying with each pass of the second hand. I thought about calling Tammy back, but the words stuck in my throat. I knew why she had done it, why she had risked being caught. She had seen the way they treated me, the way the jokes always carried an edge when my name came up, and she couldn't stomach it anymore. She had given me what I had always lacked: proof. The coffee pot from earlier still sat half full. I poured a cup, the steam rising in lazy curls, and wrapped my hands around the mug. The warmth grounded me, though the taste barely registered. For years I had lived with suspicion, wondering if maybe I was imagining the looks, the comments, the missing invitations. Now there was no room left for doubt. My family had gathered in a room, raised their glasses, and laughed at me like I was nothing. I sipped slowly, letting the silence hold me, letting the truth settle into the deepest part of me. The recording was only 10 seconds long, but it was enough to change everything. When I finally set the mug down, my hands had steadied. My tears had dried, leaving my face tight. What was left inside me wasn't just sadness. It was resolve, cold and clear, sharper than I had ever felt before. The file sat safe in the folder, locked in with the numbers, the receipts, the contracts. Together they painted the picture I had tried for so long to deny. Now it was undeniable. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of the heater filling the room. My chest still ached, but beneath the ache was something solid, something that felt like steel. The silence around me didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine until now. The next morning I woke with a heaviness that clung to me like damp air. My apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of cars moving down Hillsborough Street, and for a moment I thought about ignoring everything, shutting the laptop, and pretending the night before had been a dream. But the folder on my desktop glowed in my mind like a warning light. I couldn't unhear their voices, and I couldn't pretend the numbers on those spreadsheets didn't exist. I made a pot of coffee and sat down at the table with my notebook. The cover was worn soft from years of use, the pages filled with grocery lists and reminders. But that morning, it became something else. I wrote the words evidence at the top of a clean page and underlined it twice. My pen hovered in the air before I began listing everything I had collected. Mortgage payments, utility bills, property taxes, insurance statements. I left space beside each to mark dates and amounts. The act of writing steadied me. Each line on the page felt like a brick laid in a wall I could finally lean against. For years, the weight had felt invisible, like smoke that suffocated without leaving proof. Now, it was solid, undeniable, captured in my handwriting. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder where I had stored the documents. Frozen accounts. The name had been a joke at first, a way to remind myself to keep things organized. But now the irony wasn't lost on me. These papers, these files, they had frozen me in place for years. I dragged the recording from Tammy into the folder and sat back watching the little icons settle among the rest. My hands itched to do more, so I began scanning through my bank app, downloading monthly statements one by one, 5 years of payments stacked neatly in PDFs. Each withdrawal for $1,350 highlighted in yellow. I saved them all in chronological order, labeling them with dates so there would be no question later. The hours slipped by as I worked. Sunlight moved across the living room floor, shifting from pale morning gray to the warmer gold of early afternoon. I barely noticed. My focus was sharp. Each click, each file, each piece of paper, another layer of armor. At some point, I pulled out a shoebox I kept in the closet, the one where I had shoved receipts without much thought. Sorting through them, I found slips from the power company, crumpled envelopes from the county tax office. Even a canceled check I had written for a new water heater 3 years ago. My chest tightened as I lined them up on the table. Every scrap of paper told the same story. They had leaned on me until I became invisible, until I was only useful when I signed the checks. I pressed my palms flat against the table, staring at the spread. The papers rustled under the force of my breath. I whispered the words I had heard in that recording, not to torture myself, but to keep the fire lit. Convenient. Not family. Keep her name on the papers. I picked up my pen again and began writing dates next to the receipts, creating a timeline that stretched across the page. The picture became clearer with each entry, not a vague sense of being used, but a detailed record, a case. My phone buzzed once with a text from Tammy. "Did you listen?" I typed back yes. "Thank you." That was all I could manage, and she didn't push. By evening, my apartment looked like the office of a private investigator. Stacks of receipts, neat piles of statements, my laptop screen glowing with rows of documents. I even labeled a new folder within frozen accounts called Recordings, though at that moment it held only the one file. I knew it wouldn't stay that way. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though the clock on the stove read after 7. My body was tired, my back stiff from hours hunched over the table, but my mind was awake in a way it hadn't been for years. I had stopped being the daughter who kept her head down and started becoming someone else, someone willing to see the truth without flinching. I gathered the papers into stacks, clipped them together with binder clips, and slid them into a larger envelope. I wrote my name on the outside in block letters. Rachel Miller. It felt strange, almost defiant, to put my name so boldly on something that proved my worth, after being treated like it never mattered. As I sealed the envelope, a calmness spread through me. Not joy, not relief, but clarity. I had what I needed. They could laugh, they could lie, they could sit at that long oak table and toast to each other, but I had the record of what was real. The apartment was dark except for the lamp by the window. Outside, the city moved on without me. Headlights streaking across the street, students laughing on the sidewalk, the world going about its business. Inside, I felt like I was finally catching up to myself, finally putting words and proof to the weight I had carried. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. The silence filled me, steady and cold, but not suffocating this time. It was the silence of preparation, of someone gathering tools before a storm. When I opened my eyes again, the envelope sat in the center of the table, thick and solid, impossible to ignore. I reached out and placed my hand on it, the paper warm from my touch. My chest rose and fell in a rhythm that matched the quiet hum of the heater in the corner. The folder on my laptop, the stacks of paper, the envelope on the table. They were no longer just proof of what had been done to me. They were pieces of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine yet. Something bigger. Something that would not be ignored. I sat there a long time with my hand resting on that envelope. The room still, the night pressing in through the windows, and I knew the time for pretending was over. 2 days later, I found myself walking into a small law office on Glenwood Avenue, the kind of place tucked between a barber shop and a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread drifted through the door when I pushed it open. The waiting room was plain, just 2 chairs and a stack of magazines on the table, but my chest tightened anyway. I had been here once before, years ago, when I asked about co-signing the loan for my parents' house. Back then I told myself it was just a formality, nothing to worry about. Now I knew better. David Clark stepped out of his office, his tie loose, his salt and pepper hair slightly mussed like he had been running his hands through it all day. He had helped me with a lease once when I was 25, and I remembered him as patient, the kind of man who never raised his voice but somehow made you listen. He smiled when he saw me, though his eyes narrowed with curiosity. "Rachel," he said, "come on in." I followed him into a room lined with dark wood shelves, law books, leaning at odd angles as though they had been pulled and returned too many times. I sat across from his desk, my folder heavy in my lap. My hands gripped the edges until my knuckles ached. "What can I do for you?" he asked, settling into his chair. I slid the folder onto the desk, the envelope thick with documents. "I need you to tell me what this means. I need to know if I've been wasting the last 5 years of my life." He opened the folder, flipping through the pages carefully. Mortgage statements, utility bills, property tax receipts. He paused at the loan document, his finger running along the line that bore my father's name in bold and mine in smaller print below. "How long have you been paying this?" he asked without looking up. "Since 2018, every month. And you live there?" I shook my head. "No, I live in Raleigh. The house is in Greensboro." His eyebrows rose slightly, though he kept his voice even. "And your name is not on the deed?" "No, only as co-borrower." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. His hand rested on the file for a moment before he spoke again. "Rachel, you've been carrying the debt without the equity. That house isn't legally yours. You've essentially subsidized it for them." The words hit me with a clarity I already knew deep down but needed to hear out loud. My chest tightened, but instead of tears, I felt something colder settle in. "So what can I do?" I asked, my voice steady, though my palms were damp against my knees. He tapped the document lightly. "Legally, you can walk away. You're not obligated to keep paying unless you choose to. If they default, the responsibility could come back on you, but you also have proof of payments. With what you've collected here, no one could claim you didn't contribute. If this goes to court, you're not the villain." I let his words sink in, every sentence like a stone placed carefully on solid ground. For the first time in years, the footing beneath me felt steady. "Thank you," I whispered, though my voice broke slightly. He nodded, his eyes kind but firm. "Rachel, I've seen families tear each other apart over less. Protect yourself. You've done more than enough." I gathered the papers, sliding them back into the envelope, my fingers trembling not from fear but from the weight of decision. On the drive back to my apartment, the highway stretched long and dark, headlights flashing in brief bursts. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I knew what I had to do. That night I sat at my desk with the envelope beside me. I pulled out the small black USB drive and plugged it into my laptop. The screen lit up, the folder opening with a neat row of files. The recording from Tammy sat there like a heartbeat pulsing quietly on the screen. I created a new document and titled it The Record. One by one, I listed every piece of evidence: mortgage drafts, utility receipts, property taxes, the audio recording. I linked each file, attaching copies, cross-checking dates. The work took hours, the glow of the screen harsh against my eyes, but I didn't stop. At midnight, I leaned back the document, complete, the USB glowing faintly in the port. I ejected it, carefully slid it back into its plastic case, and tucked it into my purse. My reflection in the dark window startled me for a moment. My eyes looked different, steadier, colder. Not the woman who once begged for a seat at the table, but someone who knew the value of silence and timing. I stood and walked to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, watching the droplets slide down my cheeks. I didn't recognize the expression staring back, but I trusted it. Back in the living room, I laid out a simple dress for New Year's Eve. Dark blue plain, nothing that drew attention. I pressed the fabric flat with my hands and folded it neatly. The USB stayed in my purse, resting there like a secret only I could feel. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. For once, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like cover, like the world itself was giving me space to prepare. I slipped into bed, my mind racing with the image of my father's finger pointed at me, his voice echoing that no one wanted me there. I pictured the chandelier light glinting off the polished table, the laughter around me, the silence that followed his words. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my body tense but my thoughts sharp and deliberate. The evidence was ready, the plan was forming, and the silence I had carried all these years was about to speak. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the cold cut sharper than usual, the kind that made your breath sting when you stepped outside. I parked my car a block from my parents' house and sat there for a moment with the engine off, my hands tight around the steering wheel. The street glowed with lights strung across porches, neighbors' driveways crowded with cars. From where I sat, I could already hear faint music spilling from the house, laughter carrying into the night. I reached for my purse, checking one last time that the USB sat tucked in the inner pocket. My fingertips brushed the plastic case, and I let out a slow breath. I smoothed my dress, adjusted my coat, and stepped out into the freezing air. The crunch of gravel under my boots sounded too loud, but I forced myself forward. The front door opened before I knocked. My cousin Nathan swung it wide with a grin that faltered the second he saw me. He hesitated, then stepped aside, his eyes darting toward the living room where the voices grew louder. I nodded, brushing past him into the warmth. The house looked different than it had in my memories. The chandeliers glowed brighter, garlands wrapped the stair railing, and the dining table stretched longer with 2 new leaves added to hold the guests. I could smell roasted ham, spiced cider, the faint burn of candles that had been lit too long. Caroline's laugh cut through the noise before I even saw her. She stood near the piano, a glass of wine in hand, her red dress catching the light. Brian hovered beside her, shaking hands with one of my father's colleagues. When her eyes found mine, her smile flickered, then returned sharper, tighter. She leaned into Brian's ear, whispering something that made him chuckle. My mother was arranging hors d'oeuvres on a tray, her hands busy, her eyes fixed downward. She looked up briefly, met my gaze, then shifted away, as though the olives on the platter demanded her full attention. And then there was my father. Thomas stood at the center of the room, his posture rigid, his glass lifted as if he were already mid-speech. When he saw me, he didn't frown or smile. His face was stone, his eyes narrowing just enough to make me feel the weight of his disapproval. I made my way toward the far corner, setting my purse on a side table, careful to keep it in sight. Conversations continued, though I caught the pauses, the sideways glances, the quick whispers that rose as I walked past. Some relatives greeted me with stiff smiles, others avoided my eyes altogether. The music played softly, some old jazz record spinning in the background, but it couldn't smooth over the tension that wrapped around me like smoke. I stood near the window, my hands folded loosely in front of me, watching the way people moved around the room. I could feel the divide as clearly as if there were a line drawn down the floor. On one side, warmth and laughter, glasses clinking, Caroline glowing in the spotlight. On the other, me, steady in silence, waiting. I caught snippets of conversation as people passed. She looks tired. Does she even talk to them anymore? Maybe she shouldn't have come. Each whisper pressed harder into me, but I didn't flinch. Tammy slipped in quietly about 20 minutes later, her coat buttoned high, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She spotted me immediately, her eyes soft, and made her way over. She didn't say much, just squeezed my arm gently, a silent reminder that not everyone in that house was blind. That small gesture steadied me more than any speech could have. The evening dragged on with toasts and laughter that barely reached me. My father entertained the room with old stories. My mother nodded at guests as though everything was perfectly in place, and Caroline held court like the queen of the night. I stayed in my corner sipping water, letting the moments pass my mind, quiet but sharp. As the clock neared 11:30, the noise rose. Guests clustered around the table, filling their glasses for the midnight toast. My father cleared his throat, commanding the room with the ease of someone used to being listened to. He raised his hand and the chatter softened. That was when it happened. He turned toward me, his face flushed from drink, his voice carrying over the clinking of glasses. He pointed his finger straight at me, the same way he had all those years when he lectured his students. "No one in this family wants you here tonight." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Gasps rippled through the room, a few guests shifting uncomfortably, others staring at their shoes. My mother's hand froze halfway to her glass. Caroline smirked, her lips curving into a smile she didn't bother to hide. I felt every eye on me, the weight of silence pressing in. My chest tightened, but my face stayed calm. I let a small smile curl at the corner of my mouth. My voice was steady, almost too soft, but it carried. "All right." I didn't add another word. I didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't ask why. I let the silence stretch, let it crawl over every corner of the room until it became unbearable. Conversations that tried to restart faltered. The music felt distant, almost mocking. My father shifted, uncomfortable now that I hadn't given him the fight he expected. I lowered myself into a chair near the back wall, my hands resting lightly in my lap. The purse with the USB drive sat close enough to touch. I kept my gaze steady, my breathing, even my silence, louder than any protest. Around me the party stumbled forward, but the fracture was clear. Guests whispered behind raised hands, eyes flicking toward me and then away. Caroline laughed too loudly, trying to cover the tension, but the sound rang false. My father poured another drink, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff. I sat still, my smile faint, my silence unbroken, the weight of the night pressing down but no longer crushing me. The moment had settled, but I knew the night was far from over. The tension never settled back into place. My father tried to continue his toast, his voice wobbling for the first time that night, but people were no longer listening the same way. I watched the clock creep closer to midnight, each tick a reminder of what I had in my purse. My fingers brushed against the edge of the table, steady, even as my heart beat harder in my chest. Caroline paraded around the room, filling glasses, her laughter sharp, glancing at me with every pass like she had won something. She leaned into Brian's side, whispering and smirking. I stayed quiet, watching the smile still faint on my face. They thought my silence meant surrender. When the countdown hit 15 minutes to midnight, I stood smoothing my dress and crossed to the side table. My hand slipped into the purse, closing around the small black USB. The room carried on around me, oblivious though. I caught Tammy's eyes watching me from across the room. She tilted her head slightly, as if she knew what was about to happen. I walked toward the television mounted on the wall in the living room, the one Caroline had bragged about helping Dad install last year. The screen glowed with some muted coverage of New Year's celebrations in New York. I crouched, slightly sliding the USB into the port at the bottom. For a moment nothing happened, then the screen flickered black. Conversations faltered as faces turned toward the sudden change. "What's going on?" someone muttered. My father frowned, stepping forward, but I raised a hand lightly. The screen lit again, not with fireworks but with a simple folder titled Recordings. Caroline's laugh died in her throat. I clicked the remote in my hand. The first file loaded, audio filling the room with voices everyone knew. "She's not really family, she's just convenient." My mother's voice, flat, unmistakable. A ripple ran through the crowd, whispers, rising eyes darting to her where she stood frozen by the dining table. Caroline's voice followed, sharp and mocking. She acts like she deserves a medal every time she pays a bill. A few guests gasped, their eyes widening. Someone set down a glass too hard, the sharp clink echoing in the silence. Brian's tone came next, smooth, calculated. Don't stir the pot. Keep her name on the papers. It's clean. No need to rock the boat. The audio ended abruptly, leaving the room in a heavy silence. My father's face flushed deep red, his hand gripping the back of a chair. My mother shook her head quickly, her voice trembling. That's not how it was meant. But no one looked convinced. I pressed another button. A second recording filled the room, this time with laughter glasses clinking in the background. Nathan's voice, this time careless and cruel. Everything feels easier without her around. The crowd shifted. Some of my father's colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances. An older neighbor who had been invited set her drink down with a scowl. Caroline rushed forward, her heels clacking against the hardwood, her face pale now. "Stop it," she hissed. "You don't know what you're doing." I met her eyes calmly, my finger hovering above the remote. My silence held longer than her protest. Then I pressed play again. This time it was my father's voice, lower, steady, pointed. "She's been nothing but a burden. No one wants her here." Gasps erupted around us. Guests pulled back slightly as if the words had physically shoved them. My father's jaw clenched, his eyes darting to the crowd, searching for support that wasn't there. I stepped back, the remote loose in my hand, letting the silence consume the room again. Caroline grabbed at the remote, but I pulled it away effortlessly. The room was no longer hers to command. The clock ticked closer to midnight. 10 minutes. The air buzzed with discomfort, guests, murmuring, some moving toward the door already. The smell of ham and wine turned sour under the weight of the truth pressing into every corner. My mother tried to salvage it, her voice rising brittle. "These are private things taken out of context. We are family, this is not how we speak in public." But the recording had spoken louder than any excuse. I turned to the crowd, not raising my voice, just letting it carry. "For years I paid for this house, the lights above you, the heat keeping you warm tonight. I was their bank account, not their daughter." The murmurs grew louder, some nodding, some whispering. The truth had been given a voice, and now it echoed through the walls they had built on lies. Brian stepped forward, his face pale, his voice shaking with anger. "You will regret this." I tilted my head slightly, smiling faintly, but said nothing. His words fell flat against the proof still humming in everyone's ears. 5 minutes to midnight. Someone started the countdown early, desperate to shift the mood, but the room no longer held the energy of celebration. Laughter was gone, replaced with unease. Glasses clinked half-heartedly. I pressed play one last time. The final clip was short, only seconds long, but it cut sharper than anything else. Caroline's voice again, dripping with contempt. "She doesn't matter. She's nothing." The room froze. My sister's face drained of color. A guest muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The screen went black as the file ended, leaving nothing but silence. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks burst faintly outside, muffled through the walls, but no one cheered. Instead, people began gathering coats, whispering goodbyes without looking at my parents. Some avoided my eyes, others gave me small nods of acknowledgement. Caroline tried to speak, her words tumbling over themselves, but guests brushed past her. My father slammed his glass down, the sound shattering through the silence, but it did nothing to stop the exodus. I stood near the television, my purse back on my shoulder, my hands steady. I didn't need to say a word. The truth had spoken for me. Tammy slipped closer, her eyes wide but steady. She whispered, so only I could hear, "They'll never recover from this." I gave the faintest nod, my gaze fixed on the door, as it opened and closed, the crowd thinning with every passing minute. Outside, fireworks painted the sky in bright colors, but inside the house, darkness spread heavier with each step that left the room. The front door closed with a heavy thud, leaving the house quieter than I had ever heard it on a holiday night. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and the faint crackle of fireworks outside sounded far away. My father stood stiff by the dining table, his hand gripping the back of a chair until his knuckles turned white. My mother pressed a napkin to her mouth, eyes darting between the empty seats and me. Caroline had slumped into a chair, mascara streaked down her face, her voice cracking as she muttered that I had ruined everything. Brian finally spoke, his voice sharp and too loud in the hollow space. "You think you're proud of yourself? You just destroyed this family." I tilted my head slightly still, standing near the television, my bag over my shoulder. My voice was calm even. "I didn't destroy anything. I only showed them what was already here." Caroline shot up her chair, scraping against the floor. "You planned this. You've been waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate us." I looked at her, letting the pause stretch. "I didn't need to raise my voice. Everyone heard your words just the way you said them." My father slammed his fist against the table, the sound jolting through the room. "Enough," he barked, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and something else, maybe fear. "You think this makes you strong? No one in this family wants you here tonight." The words echoed, the same ones he had spoken in private, now repeated for everyone who remained. His eyes were wild, searching for support from Caroline, from Brian, from anyone, but the silence that followed was louder than his outburst. I smiled faintly and whispered back, "All right." I picked up my coat from the chair, sliding my arms through the sleeves with deliberate slowness. Tammy moved closer, her eyes worried but steady, her voice low. "You don't have to go right now." I shook my head gently. "Yes, I do." As I turned toward the door, my mother's voice cracked. "Marissa, wait." Her hands trembled as she reached toward me, but she did not take a step closer. "You can't just walk out like this." I paused at the doorway, looking back at the faces of the people who had once been my family. Caroline glaring through tears, Brian's jaw tight, my father flushed with anger, my mother trembling. Tammy stood slightly apart, her lips pressed tight, her eyes locked on mine. I said quietly, almost to myself, "I already did." I stepped into the cold night air. The sky above Charlotte glowed with bursts of fireworks, colors scattering against the darkness. My breath came out in white clouds as I walked down the path toward my car parked at the curb. The sounds of laughter from neighbors celebrating nearby carried faintly a strange contrast to the heavy silence I had just left behind. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it until I was sitting inside the car with the engine off, the cold seeping through the glass. When I finally looked, the screen was lit with messages. Caroline in all caps screaming through text, "You will regret this." Brian calling me pathetic. My father's voicemail waiting. My mother's message reading only, "Please come back." I stared at the glowing screen until it dimmed, then set it face down on the passenger seat. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, listening to the muffled pops of fireworks. Tammy's message buzzed in a few minutes later. I slipped the phone open and read her words. "They are blaming each other. Caroline is screaming at Brian. Dad is yelling at Mom. Everyone is falling apart." I typed back only 2 words. "Thank you." The drive back to Durham felt longer than usual, though the highway was nearly empty. Streetlights stretched in even rows, glowing faintly through the fog that settled over the road. My thoughts were sharp, not scattered. I replayed the recordings in my head, not because I needed to, but because their voices were burned into me now. Convenient, nothing, burden. By the time I pulled into the lot outside my apartment complex, the first morning light had started to soften the sky. I sat in the car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, then finally gathered my bag and stepped into the biting air. Inside my apartment, the heater clicked on as I locked the door behind me. The silence wrapped around me, steady and calm. I set the bag down, pulled off my coat, and walked to the kitchen. The habit of making coffee was automatic. Water filter grounds. The machine hissed to life, filling the space with the smell of brewing warmth. When I sat at the table with the mug between my hands, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder labeled Evidence. I dragged in the photos from the night, the screenshots of texts that had already poured in, the audio recordings saved on the USB. Each file stacked neatly into rows, a record of what had unfolded. Another buzz came from my phone. This time it was a news alert. I hesitated, then opened it. Charlotte Gazette local family gathering disrupted after private recordings surface. The article was short, speculative, but it mentioned names my parents included. I felt a strange calm spread through me as I closed the browser. By mid-morning, calls from unknown numbers started coming in one after another. I let them all ring out. My voicemail filled quickly with voices both furious and pleading. I saved none of them. In the afternoon, a knock rattled my door. I froze for a moment, then stepped quietly to the peephole. It was Norma from down the hall, holding a small plate covered in foil. Her gray hair was tucked under a knit hat, her face kind. When I opened the door, she smiled softly. I heard some of what happened. Thought you might need something sweet. I let her in. We sat on the couch, sharing oatmeal cookies, while the afternoon light stretched across the walls. She did not ask for details. She only said one thing that stayed with me long after she left. Sometimes the only way to survive a storm is to stop holding the umbrella for everyone else. That night, as snow began to fall outside, I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and sat by the window. The folder of evidence glowed faintly on my laptop. My phone buzzed again with another string of messages I did not open. I pressed my forehead lightly to the cold glass, watching flakes drift under the streetlight, feeling for the first time in years that the silence was not punishment. It was mine. The next morning, I woke to a steady pulse of notifications lighting up my phone on the nightstand. The snow outside had piled against the window ledge, muffling the city's sounds and making the apartment feel like it was sealed in glass. I reached for the phone with hesitation, half expecting more rants from Caroline. Instead, the subject line staring back at me made my stomach tighten. Legal action. I opened it slowly. The message was clipped, typed in the kind of rage that presses too hard on the keyboard. From Caroline, of course. We will be pursuing a lawsuit. You have caused financial harm. Prepare yourself. I sat back against the pillows, the words sinking in. For a second, fear flickered in me. Lawsuit. The word carried weight. But then I thought of the folders on my laptop, the names on the accounts, the years of proof saved in neat rows. Slowly, calm replaced the fear. I took a screenshot of the email and labeled it Caroline Legal Threat, January 1. I dragged it into the evidence folder where it settled among all the other files, another exhibit in the case I no longer had to argue. By late morning, my phone rang with a number I recognized from years ago. David Miller, an attorney I had worked with when I helped a nonprofit draft contracts. His voice came brisk and steady, like the click of a door locking into place. Your family is shopping for lawyers. They reached out to a firm in Charlotte, saying you unlawfully froze accounts. I sat at my table, the mug of coffee cooling beside me. What happens now, David? His chuckle was dry. Nothing. Every account is in your name. You opened them. You paid them. You managed them. That gives you full authority. Freezing them is not only legal, it is your right. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Thank you. He paused before his voice softened. You have carried them long enough. They cannot rewrite the law, and you do not owe them explanations anymore. The call ended, and I sat very still, the phone warm in my hand. His words replayed like a balm on a raw wound. Entirely legal. You're right. No explanations owed. My shoulders eased for the first time in weeks. Not long after, another message buzzed through, this one from my mother. Her tone was wrapped in desperation, dressed up as politeness. We spoke with a lawyer. He said you are within your rights. But Marissa, we are still your family. Why are you doing this? I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. For a moment, I thought about replying, explaining, but then I remembered every chair pulled away from me at that table, every laugh at my expense, every whisper calling me convenient. I saved the message into the folder and let the phone dim. Minutes later, another text came. I never thought you would humiliate us this way. Everyone is talking. Her words sank not like a knife, but like a stone into water, vanishing without a ripple. I placed the phone face down, In the afternoon, a headline appeared from the Charlotte Gazette. Sources confirm financial accounts tied to Cole family property were held solely in the name of a co-borrower, granting her full authority to suspend payments. Neighbors declined to comment, but noted shock at the revelation. I read the lines twice, then closed the laptop. The world was beginning to see, not my name, but the truth that had been hidden in my spreadsheets for years. As the day wore on, texts from Tammy arrived quietly. Mom is silent. Caroline keeps pacing. Brian left the house. Everyone is blaming everyone else. I wrote back only, thank you. That evening, another call came, this time from a restricted number. A man's voice introduced himself as a compliance officer from the bank where Brian worked. We have received an audio file regarding Mr. Cole's comments on loan documentation. Effective immediately, he has been placed on administrative leave pending review. I murmured acknowledgement and offered nothing more. He thanked me, then hung up crisp as paper snapping shut. Afterward, I sat in the quiet picturing Brian in his office as his supervisor replayed his own voice. Keep her name on the papers. It's clean. No need to rock the boat. Words meant to keep me trapped now turning back on him. Snow began again, outside flakes drifting through the glow of the street lamps. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and leaned back, watching the slow fall of white. My chest felt lighter, not with joy, but with something firmer. Justice. Around 3 in the afternoon, the Charlotte Observer updated their site. This time the article was longer detailed. It outlined years of payments made by a co-borrower not listed on the deed, utilities, insurance, taxes, all tied to the same individual. The piece never printed my name, but it did not need to. Everyone who had been in that house knew. I closed the laptop gently. My reflection stared back at me in the dark screen, steadier, now unflinching. Later that night, Tammy called. Her voice was hushed, almost like she was afraid the walls might hear her. Caroline is screaming at Mom. Dad says the family name is ruined. Uncle Todd walked out. It's chaos, I asked softly. And you? There was a pause. Then she said, I think you finally did what had to be done. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. By the time I went to bed, the snow had piled thick along the street. The silence inside the apartment was steady, not heavy anymore. My phone lay dark on the nightstand, messages waiting, but I did not reach for them. I turned off the lamp and let the quiet surround me. My chest calm, my mind clear. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass, but inside I finally felt unshaken. The knock at my door came late in the afternoon, 2 days later. I had been sitting at the table finishing a cup of coffee while the snow outside melted into slush along the sidewalks. When I opened it, Tammy was standing there, cheeks flushed from the cold, her knit scarf hanging loose around her neck. She slipped inside quickly as if afraid someone might see her. She clutched her phone in her hand and her eyes darted toward me before she spoke. They asked me to talk to you. I didn't agree, but I recorded it. She pressed a button before I could answer, and the muffled sound of voices filled the quiet of my apartment. Caroline's voice cut through first, frantic and bitter. We need her back. No one else can handle the bills. Brian muttered something low, words blurred, but I caught enough. If she doesn't come back, our reputation is finished. My mother's voice followed, soft but breaking. Maybe if she sees we still want her. The clip ended abruptly. Tammy looked up at me, her expression heavy. They wanted me to convince you to tell you they're still your family. I leaned back against the counter, letting the silence settle before I answered. Tell them they should focus on keeping their lights on before they worry about me. Tammy let out a small breath, almost a laugh, her lips curving into the faintest smile. I knew you would say that. We sat for a while after that, mugs of tea warming our hands. She told me about her graduate program in Raleigh, about papers she still had to finish, about how she had thought of moving away before all this began. I listened, grateful for the normal rhythm of conversation, the kind that wasn't steeped in accusation or desperation. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again, Not a bank account, not a scapegoat, just someone talking with her cousin. When she left, she hugged me briefly, her scarf brushing my cheek. "Be well," she whispered, before disappearing down the hall. That night, I lay awake thinking about her recording, about the way my family was scrambling to patch the hole they had torn themselves. Their words weren't about love or regret. They were about money, about control. Even in their desperation, I wasn't a daughter or sister. I was still just the one who paid. The following week, I drove across town to the bank. The roads were slick from the thaw, the gray sky pressing low over the buildings. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat. Inside were notarized forms, account records, every piece of proof I had collected. When I stepped into the bank, the warmth wrapped around me, the faint smell of coffee drifting from behind the counters. A young teller greeted me with a smile and directed me to a loan officer's office. I followed the carpeted hallway, each step deliberate. The officer looked up from his desk as I entered, his expression neutral but professional. I set the folder on the desk and slid it toward him. "I need to remove my name from a mortgage on a property in Charlotte. The account is in both names, but the title belongs solely to Elaine Cole. She will assume full liability." He opened the folder, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the documents. "You have the notarization," I nodded and handed over the forms. He tapped his pen once against the desk before he spoke again. "By signing here, you release any responsibility tied to this loan. The property will remain under Elaine Cole's name exclusively." The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed my name one last time. The officer stamped the papers, the sound sharp in the quiet room. It was done. As I walked back to my car, the cold air bit against my cheeks, but my chest felt lighter. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't tethered to that house, to its walls, to the bills that drained me month after month. Back at my apartment in Durham, I set the folder on the table and opened my laptop. The evidence folder glowed on the screen, filled with recordings, screenshots, and receipts. I scrolled through them slowly, each file a reminder of what I had carried and what I had released. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, steady and calm. I closed the laptop gently and looked around the apartment. It was small, but it was mine. No one could erase me from it. That evening, as the sky dimmed into a pale winter blue, I stood at the window with a mug of tea in my hands. The street below was quiet, lined with glowing lampposts reflecting off patches of ice. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a call, an invitation, or an apology. I wasn't wondering if there would be a chair at the table or a place card with my name. I whispered the words softly, not for anyone else, just for myself. "I am free." The sound settled into the quiet of the room, not an announcement, but a truth. Outside, snow began to fall again, drifting lightly through the glow of the street lamps, each flake soft, steady, and unbroken. The first weekend of the new year passed quietly in Durham. I woke early on Saturday, cooked myself scrambled eggs, and sat at the table with sunlight breaking through the blinds. My phone sat face down, silent for once. I did not rush to check it. I let the quiet stretch, filling the room with something steady that had been missing for years. Later that afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. Kids were playing with the last patches of snow piled along the curbs, their laughter ringing out sharp against the cold. I passed houses glowing with string lights, still left from the holidays, but instead of the ache I used to feel, I found myself smiling faintly. Those lights belonged to people who had made their own warmth, and so had I. When I returned, a message was waiting from Tammy. She had written, "They keep calling your name, but no one takes responsibility. Grandma asked what happened, and no one will tell her." I stared at the words for a while, then typed back, "I hope she remembers me the way I remember her, not the way they tried to erase me." Tammy replied only with a heart, and I could almost feel the weight she carried, standing in the middle of the wreckage of a family too stubborn to see their own reflection. The following week, a letter arrived from the bank confirming my release from the mortgage. The paper was official, stamped final. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence but as closure. For the first time in years, the house in Charlotte no longer had chains tied to my name. It was theirs to carry, and carry it they would. News trickled in quietly. The nonprofit where my mother once volunteered had cut ties. Brian's position at the bank was under review. Caroline's social circle had thinned, invitations withdrawn. It was not revenge I had sought, but the truth had a way of reshaping everything it touched. One evening, Norma knocked again, carrying a small container of soup this time. We sat together on the couch, her voice calm as always. "You remind me," she said, "of a woman I knew years ago who walked away from everything that was supposed to hold her down. They told her she would never make it, and now she is the one people remember with respect." I smiled softly, thanking her, and as she left, I felt the warmth of her words settle into me like another kind of proof. By mid-January, the constant buzzing of my phone had slowed. Caroline still tried, her words angrier, now dripping with desperation. My mother's messages had shifted from demanding to pleading. My father sent nothing. I saved them all but replied to none. One night, Tammy called, her voice low as if she had stepped outside to speak. "They fight every day. Mom blames Caroline. Caroline blames Brian. Dad doesn't say much at all. Everyone is exhausted." She hesitated before adding, "You did the right thing, Marissa." Her words carried me through the silence after the call. I set the phone down and looked around my apartment, the small space glowing with the light of one lamp. It felt warm, safe, mine. Toward the end of the month, I drove out to a quiet park just outside Durham. The lake was frozen at the edges, the air sharp with cold. I stood by the water with my hands in my pockets, watching ducks settle on the icy surface. For years I had poured everything into keeping others afloat even as I sank. Now I stood on steady ground, alone, but unbroken. As I drove home, the sky turned pink with sunset, the horizon stretching wide. I thought about what I had lost, but more than that, I thought about what I had reclaimed. My voice, my peace, my freedom. That night I sat at my table with a blank notebook. I wrote not about them, but about myself. Small goals, things I wanted to do this year. Travel somewhere new, take a cooking class, maybe even adopt a dog. Simple things, but they felt like promises to myself, ones I would not break. The silence in my apartment no longer felt like absence. It felt like space waiting to be filled with my own life. If you have ever carried a family that refused to see you, if you have ever been called convenient or felt erased, I want you to know this. Walking away is not weakness. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to let go of what drains you and step into the quiet of your own freedom. I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose peace over obligation, or walk away from a table where there was no seat for you? Share your story in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, and if this story touched something in you, make sure to subscribe so you will not miss the next one. There are more stories ahead, more voices to be heard, and more truths ready to be told.